obviously happy to.
Sorry, we're recording this part.
Okay. Obviously happy to answer questions. So I'm Lexi. As I said, I'm a fifth year PhD student and grad worker at Columbia in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures. I'm going to talk, as I said, a little bit about the rent strike. We've been organizing at Columbia for about 3 weeks now, or since the pandemic and surrounding crisis really hit New York, and Columbia began shutting down campus, making the transition to remote teaching and research, and beginning initiatives of what we've been calling sort of a soft eviction. I also want to just mention that I'm going to link in, and I don't know if they'll end up on the website, to some super helpful resources and/or overviews of what's going on with university housing and rent strike right now. So there's a response statement on housing from CPCR, which is one that we put together. The crisis is here to stay, and so are we. There's an article from The File, which is written by some fellow grad workers from Columbia, called Time to Evict the Landlord University, which is really great and super comprehensive about what's going on right now, as well as city-specific rent strike toolkits that have been put together by different organizations. So some parts of this story, particularly those that pertain to university housing, are going to be familiar to some of you, I imagine, and some parts are specific to Columbia's peculiar landlord university status and how we've been working to organize effectively around and in response to that, but also in direct opposition to that. And when I say in direct opposition, I mean working against Columbia's ongoing project of building a real estate empire and gentrifying the surrounding neighborhoods. Columbia is unique even among landlord universities insofar, and landlord universities are already unique among universities insofar as they function like real estate companies with this sort of not-profit status for legal and tax purposes, in that it has a much greater real estate holdings when compared with comparable institutions like Princeton. Columbia is actually the second largest landholder in New York after New York City itself by number of addresses, and the seventh in terms of square footage. So this is a huge part of Columbia's asset mix, and it obviously impacts tremendously the whole city, but especially the neighborhoods around Columbia, sort of the central nucleus or the campus of Columbia University, and then northward into the new Manhattanville project in Harlem. So the rent strike we're planning, also something I want to say in advance, is in solidarity and synchronized with rent strikes that are being organized across New York and in many other cities across the country. And a rent strike, from what I understand, and I want to give the disclaimer that I'm not a tenant organizer and I'm not a housing justice activist, but I think a number of us have done as much. And I think David or Anna here maybe might even be able to speak more effectively to this, but we've sort of done the most we can to get on board with all the information that's being distributed and talk to tenant organizers. But a rent strike is not just an effort to coordinate mass non-payment, which is an inevitability given what is happening in the US and the world right now, but it's also an opportunity to fight the way the financial crisis is used to retrench and to protect property owners and to impose austerity. And the eviction moratoriums that we have in many places, certainly New York, doesn't go far enough. It really just kicks the can down the road. And that's definitely the case. That's definitely the case at Columbia. So there's some unique considerations given the landlord in question is Columbia, partially because for many of us rent strikers, Columbia is not just our landlord, but our employer and our degree granting institution. So this allows them to act possibly in retaliation in strange ways that actually exceed the usual dynamics of a landlord-tenant relationship and what avenues they have to sort of hold us to account or to retaliate in the case of non-payment. So the backstory, or a little background on what's actually happening at Columbia, is that when the pandemic hit, Columbia engaged in a campaign of sort of deliberately ambiguous messaging. A lot of talk about lowering campus population density, essentially encouraging people to leave, beginning with undergrads in dormitories, many of whom, of course, don't actually have a home to go home to, and provoking many people to believe they were being evicted, or just generally to panic and flee in the face of no other solution. These are kind of what we're calling the soft evictions, and I'll explain a little bit later some of the other solutions that have only sort of made this situation more acute that they have offered. One of them, or some of these solutions are basically offering deals that incentivize a move out right now, literally to move out of your apartment in New York City right now during the shelter in place, during the pandemic, with all of the health risks and logistical impossibilities involved in that. As the only solution of not being able to pay rent, despite the fact that we have sort of consistently and through the normal avenues of advocacy with professors and petitions and all of that jazz, asking for rent relief and a cost of living adjustment. Columbia owns the buildings that we live in. So it's sort of this strange, circular situation that many of us are in. So in response to this, graduate students formed the organization I mentioned earlier, which is See People's COVID Response, a cross-campus organizing group composed of union organizers and other students that is sort of quickly becoming thankfully, a much larger coalition of campus groups with different employment and or appointment and or affiliation situations. And so CPCR is doing things that now go far beyond the rent strike, but we'll obviously keep it to the rent strike here. And that was one of the original organizing initiatives that we had that we kind of built around. Yes. So one of the first things is we were getting information. So Columbia Residential is the sort of part of facilities, which is this entire thing that I won't even go into, but it's essentially the organization or the institution that is responsible for these kinds of things. And we're always told by the university that Columbia Residential, there's this kind of church-state separation and that they have absolute autonomy and that we can't leverage or pressure them or really ask them for anything. And so what we felt like we needed to do is, instead of accept the information or the numbers that they were giving us about what kind of who's in housing or anything like that, we needed to immediately begin to collect that information for ourselves. So we knew, we composed a survey and we began distributing it in both in buildings owned by Columbia and among our pre-existing Columbia networks. To collect information on what kinds of residential situations people were in, tenants that are both affiliates and non-affiliates, right? Because Columbia has a number of buildings that have a huge amount of tenants that are not actually affiliated officially with Columbia, they just have Columbia as the landlord, and they'll be central to the rent strike as well. And what kinds of housing hardship they were facing now, and particularly in the coming months. We were already aware, even before we began circulating the survey, that we were facing a mass non-payment of rent, particularly from arts and science graduate students, because in addition to the myriad forms of housing and financial hardship that have been caused by the pandemic, loss of income, border closures, health crises, I don't think I need to enumerate much further because I'm sure you all are intimately familiar with these. The stipend that Columbia as employer issues arts and science graduate students during the summer does not actually cover the rent that Columbia landlord charges us for the apartments that they own and that we live in. And so, and this is a best case scenario because after year 5, graduate students in arts and sciences have no guaranteed funding and are still expected to pay rent during the summer. So in ordinary years, this funding system is obviously deficient and students make it work. They sublet their apartments, they move in with family and friends, they undertake paid work, et cetera, to sustain themselves during the summer months. Now, all of these options are totally off the table. And so Columbia Arts and Sciences grad students effectively, which is, thousands of students, are not going to be able to pay rent, and Columbia knows this. And this is particularly the case for international students, many of them facing border closures with no family in the US, with the possibility of, if they, for example, withhold payment of losing their visas, et cetera, et cetera. So Columbia knows this, and after using all of the established avenues of advocacy, they offered the solution of moving out. We made it clear that was not, we didn't see that to be a sufficient option. And so what they did is they, in all of their generosity, they offered, again, to let us move out without charging us a move out fee and to pay up to $500, considered on a case-to-case basis, to help us hire movers to vacate our apartments, which merely transfers or even compounds the health risks involved in moving out from us to other workers who, from what I can tell, are not even essential workers, so not even necessarily legally allowed to do a move out. So all of this to sort of come to the point of what have we been doing or how are we doing this? So one of the things we've been trying to do is I mean, first of all, to run defense on this bad deal, basically. So this is just to try to get in touch with everyone we can. So this is mostly grad students or students that this is being offered to. And to, you know, obviously, if people have a good place to go and this is the best option for them, I would never force them to stay in their apartments if they don't want to pay for it. But if people are looking to take this option essentially out of quiet desperation, or because they think it's their only option, or they're afraid of what's going to happen when the summer comes and they can't pay rent and they're stuck in their apartments, we're trying to just sort of bring people into our network and make it clear that we're working to create other options or to work together against this problem. Something that has been really important, I will say, and I think Anna and David could really speak to this, is the question of tenant organizing, which is building by building organizing. From the survey, it became immediately clear that the vast majority of respondents would not be able to pay rent come May. Many are already unable, and so although many of us had experience in sort of union or labor organizing, we were not equally prepared for the kind of tenant organizing that a rent strike requires. So through conversations with housing justice activists and tenant organizers, we began to shift from not just organizing through our already existing networks of Columbia Alliances to tenant organizing on a building by building basis. This is really important to build this kind of building solidarity for a rent strike. And so that has been a major shift or something we're doing, and I think that generally applies to rent strikes, and has also helped us to think beyond students or grad students, but to think more broadly as tenants who are dealing with Columbia as a landlord. And then the last thing, what are we at? Oh, so one of the last things is anticipating retaliation, and I'll try to put this really quickly because I suspect, because I really love to see if David and Anna have something to say. So it's kind of horrible to put it this way, but there's actually a few pandemic related things that are working in our favor, or to put it differently, that are conducive to a rent strike. One major concern potential rent strikers have obviously is retaliation from the university or the landlord. Normally in New York, the recourse landlords have when tenants stop paying rent is to take them to housing court. Due to the shelter-in-place order, housing court in New York is currently closed, and when it reopens, will be heavily backlogged with higher priority cases than Columbia's. There's also an eviction moratorium in place until June 20th, a ban on late fees and other forms of kind of, I guess you would call rent coercion. However, since Columbia is a landlord, employee, and degree granting institution, they're able to effect retaliatory measures with questionable legality, and we have conflicting opinions on this, for non-payment and more measures that exceed the normal avenues of engagement in a landlord-tenant relationship. So for example, they threaten academic standing, they bar students from registration, which would deprive them of their salary, their health insurance, and in this case, international students, their visa. This is one of the ways that Columbia, and I suspect other institutions, kind of selectively actually does connect housing with the central administration, is when it's convenient for them. We can be punished, for example, for not paying rent in a way that affects our academic standing. And these are sort of retaliatory measures that we've been actively figuring out how to try to work against or circumvent. And I guess I will wrap it up there for at least this kind of presentation. I'm sorry if I spoke super quickly. I'm trying to get it all into the limited time that we have now. Does anyone are there any questions, or does anyone else who's doing the rent strike at Columbia want to, is there anything I missed?
Anna-Valise, please.
Hi. I'd just like to add, first, thank you, Lexi. Great presentation. I just want to add a couple of the challenges that we've been facing over the past few weeks with the rent strike. I think the major challenge, I put this in the chat, is that we think that Columbia have this list based on their IT department's internet outreach list. So could be more, at the moment, or, you know, it could be less. And we have maybe 20, 25 organizers in the buildings. So the challenge of finding organizers in buildings has been really hard, especially because we're a small core organizing group. And getting surveys out to people through the typical means that we would use, just handing them off, is not available right now. One of the other challenges that we've faced is just lack of materials. So we've been trying to distribute these surveys to get more information about what people's situation looks like. But we only have one printer basically, and people are afraid to go out on campus, the contagion risk. So I'm sharing this with you on the one hand to, you know, ask for any kind of suggestions. We're looking for all the advice possible. I have a lot of knowledge, and I think we've been managing a good press outreach campaign, but the actual on the ground organizing is frustrated by the very real situation that we're all living through that has made this crisis more visible.
Okay, I think we have time for, thanks very much, Anavilis. Please do reach out to CRPC if you are able to provide any suggestions. I think we actually will have to wrap things up there unless there's anything really pressing. Someone wants to say something in Slack that's really pressing. We're already about 13 minutes over time. Okay, I'm going to end the recording now.